Good morning, everybody. Well, I'm going to assume that it's morning for most of you. It's actually about 4 o'clock in the afternoon here for me. Thank you very much for coming along to my session this morning, especially because there's a lot of really great sessions and it's so easy to jump between the rooms at the moment. So my name's Amy. I live in Perth, Australia, which means that I normally have to travel for at least 20 hours to get anywhere. And this time was no different. I mean, it took me almost a whole minute to get here today. It was mainly due to the fact that there was a dog in the middle of the hallway blocking my path. I'm really excited to get to speak at NDC Porto this year as well. Although I'm not a huge fan of the weather here at the moment, it pretty much feels like I could have just stayed in Perth. I mean, it's overcast, it's been raining off and on. Not a huge fan of the Porto weather right now. And although this may be the first session for you all this morning, I've somehow also managed to get a Friday afternoon slot again. So I'm based in Perth and I'm a freelance front-end developer, which means that I spend most of my time at the beach and the rest of it working from home in my pajamas. And technically, right now, not much is meant to have changed with how I'm working, although there's a lot less travel involved for me. I'm also very heavily involved in the Perth tech community. I help run a user group for front-end developers and the Perth Azure user group. I'm on the committee for DDD Perth, which is the largest tech conference in Perth. I attend pretty much all of the Perth tech meetups, and I work as an evangelist for YOW conferences, which is another tech conference based in Australia and New Zealand. Last year, I also became a Twilio champion and a Microsoft MVP. And in case you haven't already picked up, I have a beautiful grey and white border collie who normally sits next to me whenever I work from home. However, he has been put outside with treats so that he doesn't come and bother me while I'm giving my talk. He's also getting very confused about all of my video calls. Whenever I start a call and I say hello to the people on the other end, he can tell I'm talking to someone, so he'll instantly go to the front door because he assumes that there's someone coming to visit him. And this morning, I'm here to talk to you about accessibility. But rather than do what every other accessibility talk does, today I want to teach you how to make things less accessible. I'm also going to talk about a lot of the Aria attributes and roles that you might use in your applications. And I'm going to talk a bit about testing, some of the tools you can use for testing, and also how to decipher the warnings or errors that you get from tests that are running as part of your build pipeline. So starting off today, I want to talk about buttons, very key part of most web applications. And as I go through a lot of these examples, I'm going to provide the links to these examples online. These are all in CodePen if you want to have a look later. I will also be sharing out all of these links at the end if you don't manage to get a hold of them. So here we have two buttons. We can click on the buttons, we can get the buttons to do things, but we can see when we're hovering over the buttons, when we click, things will happen. But one of these isn't actually a button. One of these is a div. This is something that I see in a lot of applications when rather than using a button, we will use a div and provide scripts to make it function as a button. Now, yes, you can do this. Yes, you can make a div work like a button, but do you really want to when you have to use significantly more code and more scripts to get something to do something that's actually just included in the HTML? Buttons, by default, are keyboard accessible, which means anybody navigating around an application on their keyboard can access the button. they're clickable, they're tabbable, and they're focusable so that you know where you're sitting on an application. Divs don't have any of these things out of the box. Divs are literally just a container. The only thing that a div does is it will put a wrapper around whatever element's inside of it, and it sets display block to that element. That's all a div does. Although we can use scripts to do this, it is still less accessible, and it's also a lot harder for us to do. Next, I want to talk about labels, specifically labels in forms, and go through a couple of examples of different ways we use labels in forms. Now, this is an example I see a lot, which is no labels, because we have this really great attribute, which is the placeholder attribute. So rather than including a label and then having to do that, we can just include a placeholder to describe what our input is for. Now, these placeholders are really great because they display inside the input. It's nice and clean. It gives a professional look. We're able to still type in the field and the placeholder will disappear. And if we remove the text from the field, the placeholder will come back so we can see what was going on. Placeholders are amazing. This is really great. Why would we actually want to use labels if we can just use a placeholder? Because this may be what we see, but anybody using a screen reader has this announced for each of those fields. Let's edit. Edit, 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 edit. Which is fine if you're able to also have a look at the form. But if I hide those placeholders, does anybody remember what those fields were actually for? Not a great experience. So anybody who can't actually see what is going on with the form fields can't tell at all what any of these fields are meant to be. But I understand a lot of the time you may get a design that doesn't include labels, so you need to include the placeholders instead. The great thing is we can still include labels within our forms, but we can position them so that they're off the page. This means that a screen reader will still pick them up. Screen reader is able to read the label and it knows what the input is for, but it doesn't appear to any of the users. So we still have just the form inside of our browser window and the labels are positioned off the page out of view of the users. So the screen reader can access them, but the users don't encounter them, which gives a much better experience. The screen reader will still continue to announce edit, but it will also give context around the label attached to the input. If you wanted to, you can go a step further, which is to position the label as though it's a placeholder and to move it out of the way once somebody starts to type. This allows a label to stay there. You can still see the label when you've started to type within the field, but it has a clean, empty form feel. Now, you can do this by adding an event listener to each of the inputs. So here we're using JavaScript to query for all of the inputs within a form. For each of them, we're adding an event listener. We're checking for if there's any input. We're checking for the, so here we're checking for any input. That's the event we're checking for. So if anybody's typing anything inside the field. If they type anything inside of the field, we're then checking whether or not that field now has a value, and we're going to make sure that value isn't an empty string. If the field now has a value and that value isn't an empty string, we're then going to add a class to that input to let us know that something's been typed in it. Sorry, we're not actually adding the class to our element. So we're getting, here's the element. which is being typed in. This is the input being typed in. We're then going to go up the HTML, the DOM tree, and we're checking for the previous sibling, and we're going to add a class list to that. So the previous sibling, we know in our form is going to be a label, and so we're going to add the class to the label. There would be different ways that you can do this, and it may work a little bit easier, but this is the example that I've included today. All I then have to do is use CSS to position the label so that it sits over the form input, and if it has the class active, to move it back up. And I can also include a transition so that you can see it moving rather than it just flashing between the two of them. Next, I want to talk about icon labels. So we often see them in social menus, social navigation menus. Rather than include the names of the different platforms that we're linking through, we can just include the icon and people can access it that way. So we would see it somewhere like this, with a list of different social profiles, my CodePen and my Twitter and my website, and include maybe an image or an SVG icon for each of these. Now this is great, except for when someone uses a screen reader, they have announced link, 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 link. And again, if they can't see what that icon is, that doesn't provide much context to what you're actually linking to. And as we've all probably learned at some point, don't click on a link if you don't know where it goes. That doesn't seem very trustworthy. So similarly to our form input, we can actually include a label and then make it position of the page. So here I've included a label for each of my links inside of a span element. Including it inside a separate element makes it really easy for me to style it and position it. So I include the label for each of my links and then use CSS to position those off the edge of my page, which means that now when I go through and the screen reader has a look at each of my links, it's able to read the text that's in my span and provide more context around where I'm linking to, but that's not appearing on the page. So they're off the edge of the page. Next, I want to talk about hover effects. Now, hover effects are the kind of things that we see when hovering over links or buttons or an element that we may be able to interact with. This is often done by changing color to signify that there's something you can do with it. When I hover over the link, I change the color to let people know that they can click on it. As we can see here, the color is changing on hover, which means I must be able to do something, probably click on it. Now this is great, but what happens if a user has a vision deficiency and is unable to differentiate between the two colors you're using? Can you tell the difference between the colors here? You might be able to just a little bit, but it's still incredibly difficult. Using something like a color change leads to difficulties if someone has various different vision deficiencies. So rather than that, we can use a different hover effect, changing the background, adding a border, or changing the underline on the text. It means we're not just relying on differentiating between color. This means that if somebody is unable to tell the difference between two different colors, they're still able to see the hover effect that we see here. Now, a lot of people often ask, well, there's such a small percentage of people, and here I've used an example of a very, very extreme vision deficiency. And there's such a small percentage of people who are impacted by this kind of thing. So it's not just around permanent impairments. I have a feature on my phone. Anybody here have an Android phone? I have a feature on my Android phone which helps. It's meant to help me take time away from technology, and now I'm not doing great with that because technology is the only way I can talk to people. It's I forget. It's not Do Not Disturb. What it does is it will, similar to how you can change the brightness on your screen as it gets later in the evening so that it doesn't affect your eyes as much. It will automatically turn on grayscale on my screen on my phone to let me know that it's time to go to bed and I should be putting my phone down and stepping away and getting ready for bed. And I didn't think too much about it until I was having a look at somewhere. I was moving house and I was having a look at an application by a company called Domain, which is an Australian real estate company. So I was having a look on the map and they had little pins for each of the houses that I was looking at. And once you've looked at a property, it will change the pin from green to red to let you know that you've looked at it. And it wasn't until my phone turned grayscale on that evening that I realized I can't tell the difference between green and red. So even though I have great vision and I don't have a color a form of color blindness, this is still something that affects me when people are only using color to differentiate between two different states. Next, I want to talk about Tabindex. Now, Tabindex is a property you can apply to dictate the order of elements that will be tabbed when someone is navigating by tabbing through when somebody's tabbing through your website, the order that the elements will be selected. This is often used in things like forms. Now, for someone who hasn't worked with Tabindex before, this is a quick breakdown of what the different properties you can give it are. So a Tabindex of 0 means that the element can be navigated to via a keyboard. This is something we often use if you want people to be able to access an element that you wouldn't normally. For example, if you've made a div a button and you want people to be able to access it via the keyboard, giving it a Tabindex of 0 puts it in the running to be accessed via a keyboard user. A Tabindex of -1 says that it can't be navigated to via a keyboard. This isn't something that you can interact with. And a positive tab index, for example, a tab index of 1, 2, 5, 10, will dictate the order that elements will be interacted with. For example, if I have a form and I number each of my inputs, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, when somebody tabs through it, these will be highlighted in the order, starting at 1 and finishing at 5. This means you can dictate the order that the fields will be interacted with if somebody is using their keyboard. Now, this is really great because you get control over how people are accessing things. But what happens when you have to add a new input into your field and you may not remember about the tab index, or maybe another developer who doesn't add it? And you then have a field that isn't in the order dictated. This means that anybody who's using a keyboard to navigate through your application is going to have a fairly poor experience because the form isn't working the way they expect it to. Now, this is something I have seen many times as a user, just trying to fill in a form where people have tried to include the tab index. So unless you actually need to change this, this is something that we probably shouldn't be using. Next, I want to talk about Aria attributes. Now, Aria is something that often grabbed for when you're working on a project where you know accessibility is very important, but most of the time they're not actually necessary. Earlier this year, I was working on a project that needed to be accessible, it needed to conform to a certain requirement. And a developer I was working with ran a testing tool which told him to add roles to the various elements on the page. Now, role is an attribute that you can add, and there's a heap of different roles that you can assign. This is a few of them that I've included from the page, things like button, checkbox, slider, article, heading, complementary, banner, navigation, whole heap of them. There's a list on the Mozilla Dev Docs if you really want to have a look at all of the roles that are available. But he was having a look through, and we had one of those sections which had a bit of text and it had an image, very nice looking. And he went, well, this has the role of presentation because this is a very visual point. And so he added the role of presentation to the element. Now, I then went through and ran a different testing tool, and it flagged an error. Because what the role of presentation had done was it let a screen reader know that everything inside of this element is just for visual effect only. So it doesn't actually provide any context. There's no element you need to interact with. So it just ignored the whole thing, despite the fact that there was actually stuff to do inside of it, like a link you could click on. What we could have done instead was only singling out the image, which was visual, and including an empty alt tag, which lets a screen reader know that this image is just for visual effect and does not provide any additional information or context to the user. So it ignores it. Alt text is the attribute to define an alternative text description of the image. So if you do actually have an image that's important for people to look at, for example, a graph or a figure, you can describe it in the alt text. But for a lot of the images that we see on websites, they don't provide any additional context. And so this lets screen readers know they don't need to worry about them. Now, the secret with a lot of Aria stuff is that semantic HTML actually negates the need to use these labels and roles. And I found a really great section on the Mozilla Dev website reminding us that many of these were later incorporated into HTML5, and we should use the correct semantic HTML element over using Aria if that element exists. For example, we don't need to use the role of button because we can just use a button, which infers that it's a button. We don't need to use the role of form. We have a form. We don't need to use the role of navigation because we have a navigational element. So making sure that we're using proper semantic HTML goes a really, really long way with making our websites more accessible. Another one that I see a lot of is Aria labels. Now, Aria labels allows us to label a current element, and it's used to describe when there isn't text to describe it. For example, if we're using a bunch of icons in a navigation menu, we could add an Aria label to each of the icons to describe what it is. We could add the Aria label there to let the users know what it is that they're clicking on. However, as Aria label is a HTML attribute, it doesn't get included when a browser is used to automatically translate content on a page. So have you ever gone to a website and it's in a language you can't read, and so you use Chrome or your browser to translate the page? Anybody ever done that before? Trying to make sure no one's falling asleep because the coffee hasn't kicked in yet. This is the first time I've done a remote presentation where I can actually see faces, so it is nice to just sort of see people at the corner of my eye. And if anybody did fall asleep, it would not be the first time somebody has fallen asleep in one of my presentations. Only this time it's not somebody in the second row. It's actually somebody who's just gotten up and sitting at home on their couch. So Aria labels aren't included when we go through and translate content on a web page, which means if I write my Aria label in English and someone tries to translate my web page to Portuguese, they won't know what the label is because that label hasn't been translated. However, we can use Aria labeled by to do this, which allows us to define text content elsewhere, and that is used to describe a particular element. Now, this works fairly similarly to how we link a label and an input. The difference is with Aria labeled by, we link the content to the label, whereas with inputs and labels, we link the label to the input. So you can use Aria labeled by, and if a user tries to translate your web page, they will get the label content translated as well. Okay. Next, I want to talk about testing, because although we're all going to go away from this today and make sure that we're writing more accessible code, we're going to make sure our forms have labels. I was helping teach a workshop the other week, and one of the other mentors went through and wrote a form for everybody that had no labels. Had to stop him and get him to make sure it had labels in it. Although we're going to make sure that we're writing accessible code, a lot of the time we're working in big teams of other developers, or it may even have been code that we wrote at 2 o'clock in the morning 3 years ago and we had no idea what was going on there. There are a heap of different tests that we can do to make sure that our code is still accessible. I want to add a disclaimer that although there are several automated tests, and there are a bunch of tools that you can use, to properly test for accessibility, you need to use user testing. You need to have this testing done by somebody who's using the assistive technologies every day. There's a huge difference between when I open up a screen reader to test something on my computer and someone who uses it as the only way to navigate the internet every single day. So if this is something that your work, your company is really taking seriously, see if you can get somebody to come in and run proper user testing to make sure it works. In the meantime, we can run a bunch of different testing tools over the application to get a lot of the little things. Now, one of the tools that I really like is a tool called Pally. Pally is open source. It has a few different versions, but I really like the command line version because it's something I can include in my build process. I can run it automatically and it just does stuff. And I can also log all of the test results within my Git repository so I can track improvements over time. Now, Pally runs tests against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, and you can find a full list of the guidelines on the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative, the W3C Way web page for the WCAG guidelines, one of those acronyms. They have a full list of the guidelines, but the great thing about Pally is it will actually check your application against all of these guidelines, and it just tells you the ones that you need to look at. Because unfortunately, the accessibility guidelines aren't very accessible for people to read. Even if you work in accessibility, they're a little bit difficult to deal with. And now I'm going to do a demo with Pally, which we're going to hope works. So now here is one that I've prepared earlier. So Pally is used, so I've included it in my project, which I'll show my project first. My project is a blog because I can never decide what kind of application to use on a demo. So I have a blog that I'm running tests on. Now I've included Pally in my project. So it's one of the packages that I've installed because there's no way I'm going to try and install it while still running an online web call. Now, apologies if anybody here hasn't used JavaScript before. Pally writes its tests in JavaScript, so this may be a little bit foreign to you. I'm including the Pally package. Now, Pally also uses Puppeteer to run its tests. Puppeteer is a way to use it's a way to virtually run tests in a browser without actually opening the browser, if that makes sense. So I'm using I'm requiring the Puppeteer package so that I can do that. And I'm also requiring an additional package which allows me to save a file when I'm done. I've defined a function here for my test. And in that, I've defined a couple of the details that I'm going to use to run my test. Now, the first one is I've defined some custom settings for the Puppeteer browser. This is because I run a Windows computer, but I use WSL, which is the Windows subsystem of Linux, which means my computer gets confused because it thinks it's on a Linux machine, but it's actually on Windows. So when I try and run this on the command line, it tries to open the browser where it knows it would be stored on a Linux machine and gets really confused. So this is a hack to get it to work in WSL. Great thing is I've done all of the research, so I know how it works now. Then I'm also defining, I'm going to run a bunch of tests. I've set it up to do promise all, which means that it will go through and run multiple tests, one after another, which is good because it means I only have to do it through the one function. Now, the first thing I do inside of the Pally function is I'm pulling in my site URL from up here. I want it to visit the page of one of my blog posts, and I want to check that. I'm using the browser variable that I've defined at the top so that runs properly. I'm then also going to define the WCAG standard that I want to test it against. And I want to test it against the AAA standard, which is the top tier. I want to make sure my blog is super accessible to everybody. One of the other features that I use within Pally is I'm also going to go through and save a screenshot of my application when it runs the test. Now, this is really useful because you're using a headless browser, it may render the application differently to how you expect it. And so saving a screenshot means that I can see exactly what Pally did. This is really useful for if you get a weird result or something that you weren't expecting, you can see exactly what it looked like. I'm then defining another test. I'm going to save a screenshot for that as well. And for this one, I'm also going to define the viewport. And I'm going to set a small viewport because this one I want to test the mobile screen size. And I can also define that it is mobile, so it tests against those kind of devices as well. And then I also want to do another test, again, also against the home page, but this time I'm testing against a desktop screen size. At the end, I take all of the results that I've gotten and I'm going to write them to a file, which I'm saving inside of my test results folder. And so it will give me a JSON string. And if I get an error, I want it to log out the error. Now, if I can get my terminal up, which is currently hiding behind everybody's faces, I think. No. Open up my terminal. That is still hiding behind everyone's faces. Okay. So I'm going to open up my terminal and move into inside my project folder. And I've already set up a script to run this, but I can just run it with Node. And so using Node to run the file inside my test folder, I'm going to get the pally.js file, which is the file I've written my test in. And I'm going to go through and run that. And what that will do is that will then load my web page inside of the Puppeteer browser, and it will run various different tests against the guidelines for the AAA specification that I've set. And it's now done. It's now finished running the tests, and I can find those tests here in a lovely big JSON document. There we go. That's a lot of issues for my application. Okay, so we can go through and have a look at a lot of the issues that I've got here. So here says the title element in the head section should be non-empty. So this is really great because it will give me a lot of information about the issue that I'm getting. So here it's given the particular guideline code that it's found an error with, whether or not it's just an error or a warning, the message that it's given, which the title shouldn't be empty. Well, the title should be non-empty. It provides information about the HTML element that it's had issues with, which is a title that we can see is empty. I haven't set a title there. Also, the selector to make it easier to find where exactly that element is. So no inside HTML, inside head, inside title. So it includes a lot of information that I need to have a look at in my application. If I needed to find more context around this guideline as well, I can have a look. So this is the particular guideline that it's flagged. And if I find, this is a list of all of the WCAG guidelines. And if I search for the guideline that it flagged, I can find that here. So this is the section, and this is the guideline that it's had issues with. The title element in the head should be non-empty. So that's really great for finding more information about what the actual issue is and what you should be doing to fix it. Although this one's fairly obvious, I need to set a title in my head section, which we do it now so that it's done. That is not what I was after. Yeah, that's where it'll be. Yeah, there we go. So if we have a look there, I'm not getting a title. So I can change that to be my testing blog. And now if I run my test again, that issue should be fixed now. And wait for it to finish. There we go. So now if I have a look at my test again, I no longer have the error about the title attribute. Instead, I have a bunch of different errors about contrast. which I want to have a look at later. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can provide the Pally results as well. So I recommend having a look at their website if you'd like to use it. You can give a nice, easy to read HTML report. You can format it to do exactly what you want. Awesome, demo worked. Now, before we wrap up, I want to give a bit of information on deciphering some of these test results that you might get. A lot of the time they are fairly straightforward, like title should not be empty, but sometimes they can be a little bit confusing, or may suggest that you need to do things that you don't need to. So it's important to understand the principles that you're trying to fix. Otherwise, you might end up putting role presentation on an element that actually has really important content. So this is one that we get a lot of: image element missing an alt attribute. Use the alt attribute to specify a short text alternative. Now, this happens a lot, particularly when you're pulling in images from somewhere else or dynamically generating content. We may not have the ability to go through and define an alt attribute for each element. Now, one thing that we need to remember with this, which we've already touched on, is not actually everything needs an alt attribute, but we don't have to write a short text alternative. If your image is only meant to be used to add a visual effect, if it's a nice pretty picture or background, something that doesn't provide additional information to the users, then it's okay for it to not include an alt attribute. An alt text alternative. All we need to do is just provide an empty alt tag, so alt with just 2 quotes. That will let the screen reader know that it doesn't need to worry about the image. If we don't include an alt text alternative, what the screen reader goes through and does is it reads out the path of the image, which this person isn't too bad because I've named my image nicely and it's a fairly short path. But if you have a think about some of the paths to images in your applications, you don't want somebody to have that read out to them because you can't stop it once the screen reader gets started on that. Another one which we saw in my application is this element has insufficient contrast at this conformance level. Expected a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1, and the text in this element has a contrast ratio of not a number to 1. So this is an error that I get a lot because it's having issues comparing the contrast ratio. So if we have a quick look at one of the places that I have this, we have a look. Okay. HTML body header H1A. So, there we go. So that would be here. Now, okay, that could have an issue. See if I can find a different one that I know definitely doesn't have an issue. Time. Okay, so I'm getting an error about this one here where I have the date. It said that the date has insufficient contrast with what's going on behind it. And if I have a look, so it's really great to have a look at the developer tools. Most of the browsers now have accessibility contrast checkers built into the tools. So if I have a look here where the date is, I can see this is the color. It actually has a contrast checker in here. And so it has a look and compares it. So this is the color, this is the background of the element behind it. And it said that this has a contrast ratio of 16.42, which definitely meets the AAA requirements because that says I need to have at least 7. So this is really great for going through and checking to make sure. So it's important to make sure that we're validating, because a lot of these errors are more the fact that we have a tool running in the command line It's trying to test against a visual thing. So that one's a little bit hard to check against. An important one to know as well, if it's probably not an issue, see this here where it says it's not a number? Probably means something has gone wrong. Something has broken there. Another one that I see a lot of is this one. This form does not contain a submit button. So we get this happen a lot in things like search forms and newsletter signups because they're nice and small and it's one field and we can just hit enter to submit it. But the problem is we then don't have a submit button. So again, similar to the labels, making sure that we're including a submit button, and then we can position that off the page. So it's still there and it's still something that keyboard users can interact with, but it doesn't have to visually appear on the page. Alternatively, there is ways that you can style the submit button so it's still one small field that people can use. Now, one of the other tools that you can use for testing is Axe, which is a very, very widely used accessibility testing tool. They have a heap of different extensions and plugins that you can use. For example, there's React Axe for integrating with a React application. They also have a browser extension that you can use on Chrome and Edge now that that's on Chrome as well. So you can run tests that way. A couple of other tools I really like using, this one, Who Can Use, which is a color contrast checker, but as well as testing the contrast ratio between two colors, it also then works out what the contrast would look like to people with various color deficiencies. So that one is really great to have a look at to make sure there's still contrast ratio for everybody. So Who Can Use is really great. It was actually built by a Perth developer. Accessible brand colors is another great one, maybe worth giving to your designers at work. This is really useful for putting in all of your brand colors and it will compare each of them against one another. So you can see what color combinations you can use, both the text and background colors, and you can single out which ones work and which ones don't. So that one's really great for making sure that designers don't send through something that doesn't quite pass the color contrast standards. Another really great package is the color blindness emulator, which I actually used in my presentation when I was simulating the grayscale. So it provides a SVG filter, which you can use to simulate the different kinds of color blindness. Really easy to use. Include the SVG file in your project and then just use CSS to set it as a filter over the element using the relevant filter to what it is that you're wanting to test. That's a good one to have a look at. If you're wanting to do some more stuff with testing accessibility, there's a really great blog post by me that I wrote Christmas last year, 12 days of front-end testing. In it, I list a couple of accessibility testing concepts and as well as a bunch of different tools, and it's Christmas themed. So it's probably not the right time of year now, but hopefully you might get a giggle out of it. I also wrote a blog post back in January for JavaScript January, which is getting started with front-end testing. And the first part of it was going through running the accessibility tests, which I did here today. I also did my talk about front-end testing at NDC London back in January, back when we were allowed to see people in person. And that is now online if you would like to test out a little bit more about accessibility testing and see me try and do a demo and have it not work. If you're looking for something to try and make your application a little bit more accessible, there's a great set of accessible components at inclusive components. There's a bunch of them that are available free on the website. It's by Hayden Pickering. Otherwise, there is also a ebook or a physical book. I think it's in the living room. I have the physical book. It's a really nice book. A lot of really great components going through things like accordions and tab sections and sliders and the various things we have to build in our day-to-day, but providing us with code to make sure that they're fully accessible to everybody, which is awesome. The examples that I included in my talk today, I have a collection of them in my code pen, which the link is there, and I will also include the link in my slides at the end of the day. So that includes a lot of the different examples if you want to have a look at my code again or have a play around with it yourself. Now, normally I would say you can find me around the rest of the conference. I will be sticking around on the Slack for a little bit. I'm endeavoring to make it to the party tonight. We're gonna be playing Remote Exploding Kittens. If anybody wants to join, we'll be talking about that in the hashtag NDC Party channel. If you can't catch me on Slack, if I do fall asleep because it's really late here, you can find me on the internet. I'm mostly on Twitter. You can also find my website. I occasionally write things on blogs, not as much as I should. You can find links to my talks, my GitHub, and because I'm starved for physical and human interaction right now, I've also started streaming on Twitch. So after the conference, if you would like to get back into watching people make idiots of themselves on the internet, you can tune in. I occasionally stream stuff on Twitch writing code. Thank you very much for listening to me this morning. Hopefully the coffee has kicked in. Hopefully I haven't had the second person fall asleep in one of my talks. I think we do have a bit of time if anybody who's in the WebEx would like to ask a question, either in the chat or if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question. We've got a bit of time for that. Otherwise, I will chat to you on Slack or the internet, or maybe one day and soon we will be allowed out of our houses and we can see each other in person. Any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there is a tool for test Android and or iOS apps as you did for web.
Yes, there would be. It depends what you're testing. I actually have a feeling. I saw something with this morning. Yes. So Axe, which I went through, Axe have accessibility library for Android. So you would be able to use that to do testing with it. I do know they also have the screen read. I think it's TalkBack on Android, but I might be wrong. So you can test that out for testing screen readers. Other than that, I'm not too sure. Unfortunately, I haven't done much with native applications, but I do know people who have. So if you get in touch with me on Slack or on Twitter, I can find out and get you some resources for that one.
Just another one, sorry. We are talking about visual special needs, but there's another different needs that we should be aware.
Yes. Yes. So today, I should have mentioned at the start, most of the stuff that I looked at today was more around visual impairments, although sometimes a lot of so being able to navigate stuff by keyboard comes with a few other impairments as well. I try to remember ones off the top of my head. Visual, making sure, so then you've got hearing impairments, so making sure if you have anything like a video playing, having a written, a captioned version available for people. Trying to think what else. Making sure you're not doing anything funky with your website. So things like sliders, and a lot of the things that look really cool, you know, the flashy bits and the nice effects and stuff like that. That kind of thing can have issues for people. Can cause issues for people as well. So trying not to do anything too fancy. The other thing that's a big one is mobility impairments. So making sure that it's really easy for people to click on things. That includes things like when particularly, so you build for mobile. So making sure that people have a decent size to click on something and then accidentally click on something else. So this doesn't even just come down to someone with mobility impairments. This comes down to someone with big fingers trying to use a smartphone. So making sure that they have plenty of room for tapping on the right things as well.
Thanks.
Yep.
Hi, can I add something, please?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you, Amy. It was a really great talk, and I learned a lot. I have a question for you on a website. But first of all, I want to respond to Tiago on his question. Get in touch with me via Slack. As Amy does know, I did a lot of talks, a lot of talk on accessibility mobile apps, accessible mobile apps in Xamarin. But also, it's not only the Xamarin coding language; it's also about accessible principles for mobile apps. I focus most of the disabilities like blindness and so, but my biggest expertise is people with learning disabilities and autism, so I also have a great advice for that. I also spoke at a few NDCs. Oh my God, and you're showing it, yeah, of course. I also spoke at a few NDCs in the past, and I speak at London at NDC Oslo, which is another talk. So if you look at me, I think, yeah, search me on the YouTube on NDC, you find way too much about my accessibility insight on intellectual disability. So that was for you. A question for Amy. For
Yep.
my own website, for my business, my blog, and also my business and resource, we changed to WordPress because it's way easier to manage. Even I can develop .NET and so, but it's really more easy to manage. And I have a question on, are there plugins or assets in WordPress to make more accessible buttons to just WordPress and accessibility? That's my first question. I asked some two first, but then you can make an answer. And my second question is, I learned about Aria. I also heard it before. I'm not a big fan of JavaScript. Are there accessible things like Aria already for Blazor? Or is there a pipeline or other possibilities with Blazor? So WordPress and Blazor are my questions. Thank you.
Yeah. So Pally, which I use for testing. So I'll start with that one. So Pally, which I use for testing, it technically isn't. So you write the test in JavaScript, but it does work on anything. So all you have to do is give it a web page. So unfortunately, yes, you do need to know JavaScript to write the tests, but you can run it against any web page. They do have a few other different examples that you may be able to use, which it may be worth having a look at. Unfortunately for WordPress, I do actually do a fair bit of WordPress development, but I haven't done any. I kind of have things in two boxes. I have my business stuff, which is where I do WordPress development, and then I have my community and my speaker stuff, which is where I don't use WordPress. So unfortunately, I don't know anything off the top of my head. I can have a look and let you know though, because I'm sure there's something out there. There's a plugin for everything. However, in saying that, a lot of the new WordPress editor Gutenberg, a lot of the stuff that it creates is fairly accessible. Unfortunately, the editor itself is not great. That is really interesting about WordPress and accessibility though, so I might have a look at it. And if not, I know a few developers who do a bit more stuff, so they may have encountered something there. Was that all of the
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy with this question.
Yeah, no, it's good to see you again, Denny, at least through the computer. Denny and I have run into each other at a few of the conferences now, so it's nice to have a familiar face in my audience today.
And I will be at NDC Oslo too. And you too, I saw on the internet?
Yes. I will be giving this talk again at Oslo. Well, not at. I can't work out whether I still say at if I haven't gone anywhere to a conference.
Yeah, I call it at because virtual, you have to leave it as fully as possible. I call it at, but it's a better of a name. I'm doing not a brand new talk, but it's the NDC talk. I did the talk at another conference in real life this year in Finland, but not an NDC. But the NDC talk of a brand new talk for me, so maybe see you there also in my audience.
That'll be
something brand new at Oslo.
That'll be cool. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Nope, no questions. Well, it was lovely to have the chance to chat with you all today. Hopefully, I'll see you around at some point. And yeah, if you have any more questions, just get in touch. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I stop sharing my screen there.